Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I will begin my sermon today with a few words from the famous theologian Mick Jagger. St. Paul the persecutor was a cruel and sinful man. Jesus hit him with a blinding light. Then his life began. Yes, the Rolling Stones wrote a song called Saint of Me in 1997, featuring commentary on several illustrious Christians, including St. Paul. I love Jagger's summary of that day because he succinctly captures the essence of the event. A cruel persecutor, Jesus blinds him with the light, and then St. Paul's life really begins. Paul becomes an instrument of God's purpose. The story of Paul's conversion in Acts is one of the most dramatic stories in the Bible. It begins with this very exciting phrase, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest. Remember, in those days, Paul, otherwise known as Saul, was a devout Pharisee, a member of the temple leadership, who saw these upstart Christians as a threat to his beloved Judaism. He was a man of violence who got permission from the high priest to scour the country and arrest and perhaps kill any Christians he found. It was while Saul was on one of these trips that he was blinded by the light. And the voice of Jesus spoke to him asking, "Why are you persecuting me?" Saul is stunned to learn that this Jesus fellow is real, that he has an eternal life and that the resurrection is real, that his violent assumptions had been so completely wrong. Paul is then led to Damascus, where he waits, struck blind, not eating or drinking for 3 days. And then God sends a local Christian, Ananias, to baptize Saul and welcome him into the Christian community. Now, Ananias, this Christian in Damascus, was, not surprisingly, a little concerned to hear that he was to go see this dangerous man. But Ananias, too, was blinded by the light. And God tells him, "Go, for Paul is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel." In other words, God chooses rather imperfect people to do his work. In addition, both Saul and Ananias have their prejudices challenged. Saul learns that Christians really are following God. And Ananias learns that even a monster like Saul can change his stripes. A few years ago, Bill and I saw a wonderful movie called 42, a movie about Jackie Robinson and how he broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. When Jackie Robinson was signed on to the Brooklyn Dodgers, there's this wonderful exchange between the owner, team owner, Branch Rickey, and Robinson. Rickey told Robinson that he was going to have to face some real ugliness and threats and violence from all quarters and to be prepared. But that under no circumstances could Robinson fight back or defend himself. Robinson is shocked and asks, "You want a player who doesn't have the guts to fight back?" "No," says Rickey. "I want a player who's got the guts not to fight back." Rickey then goes on to quote Jesus' advice to turn the other cheek. In that moment, Robinson too is blinded by the light. He ponders this new insight and agrees. And from that moment on, he becomes the very personification of grace under pressure. He resists responding with violence at great personal cost. The ugliness and threats thrown at him, even from his teammates, even from his team fans, is appalling. Yet throughout it all, Robinson never sinks to their level. He remains, externally at least, calm, all while exhibiting his superb baseball skills. There are a couple of players on the team who actually do accept him from the start. Most importantly, a man from Kentucky named Pee Wee Reese. One day the team is sent down south where Reese is from, and he knows he has a lot of fans in the area. But at this time, Reese is shocked to discover that for months, he hadn't been aware of this, Robinson had been receiving death threats, not only against himself, but about his wife and his newborn infant son. In learning that, Reese too is blinded by the light of the gospel, and it compels him to act. The day arrives when the team shows up for the game in the South. Reese runs out onto the field, and the stands go wild, cheering and clapping. Hometown boy makes good. And the movie closes in on one father and son, the son being not more than about 8 years old. And the son is beside himself with joy to see his hero in the flesh. But then, Jackie Robinson runs out on the field. Mood changes quickly. Everyone starts booing, and racial slurs are hurled out, including from the boy and his father. But just then, Reese saunters over to Robinson and casually drapes one arm over his shoulder and has a little chat with him right in the middle of the field. And the two of them are laughing and talking. And the crowd stops booing, confused. The camera turns to the father and son, and you can see the waves of emotions flashing across their faces. They don't know what to think. Their biggest hero supports their worst fear. Pee Wee Reese likes Jackie Robinson. They were having a hard time wrapping their minds around it. It was a blinding moment, and something like scales fell from their eyes. Reminds me a lot of both Paul and Ananias. What? You mean my biggest enemy, the Christians, are actually good? You mean that evil man, Paul, the one that God actually has chosen to spread the gospel? You mean that terrible black man is actually supported by my hero, and he is the one who's going to lead my team to victory? Talk about turning your world upside down. The gospel calls us to challenge our assumptions. Perhaps our enemies are not who we think they are. Perhaps they are important parts of God's plan too. As God said to Ananias about Paul, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen. And when the risen Christ is met by the disciples by the sea while they were fishing, he has an exchange with Peter. He told him to stop fishing. Christ is risen. The world has changed. Jesus blinded Peter with the light of a new reality. Peter was to no longer remain a fisherman. Jesus reminds him 3 times, feed my sheep. In a similar way, Paul was told by God to stop persecuting Christians and instead to feed his sheep, tend his people by spreading the gospel. Ananias was told by God to reach out to Paul, and in doing so, he too was feeding God's people. So too Reese was blinded by the light of righteousness in the face of raw racism. And by publicly supporting Robinson, was tending to God's people. So too Robinson, by turning the other cheek and engaging evil and violence with grace, followed Christ's example, and in doing so was feeding God's people. Peter, Paul, Ananias, Pee Wee Reese, Jackie Robinson, all of them had to take on personal risk. Most of them had to overcome prejudice. Most had their professions take a new direction. All had to nurture God's people in the process. All of them were instruments of God despite their questions, concerns, failings, emotions, and doubts. God challenges our assumptions about others. How has God blinded you with the light, truth, the gospel? God uses cracked pots. In what way are the people around you, even your enemies, instruments of God? In what way